Good morning, everybody. Hello, and welcome back to another Funky Bunch at Sunday Brunch Podcast. Coming at you live Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Granted, anybody actually watching this at any other time is just watching the replay, so it's no longer live for you guys, but you know what? Y'all are listening. Y'all are watching. So, thank you. So, anyway, we are continuing our adventure through all of the video game genres and subgenres. If you remember, we've already gone through the action genre, which, for a quick recap, an action game emphasizes physical challenges that require hand-eye coordination and motor skill to overcome. They center around the player who is in control of most of the action. Most of the earliest video games were considered action games. Today, it is still a vast genre covering all games that involve physical challenges. And then we looked at all of the subgenres that fall under just the action genre. So those were the platform games or platformers, the shooter games or shooters, fighting games, beat 'em up games or brawlers, stealth games, survival games, battle royale games, and rhythm games. And now we're going to continue on with our genre sections by looking at the action adventure genre. So, the action adventure is a video game genre that combines core elements from both action games and adventure games. We've already gone over the action game, and we're going to go over the adventure game afterwards. But we're doing action adventure now. Why? Because it's alphabetical. So, action adventure is a hybrid genre, and thus the definition is very inclusive, leading it to be perhaps the broadest genre of video games and can include many games which might better be categorized under narrow genres. Typically, pure adventure games have situational problems for the player to solve with very little or no action. If there is action, it is generally confined to isolated minigames. Pure action games have gameplay based on real-time interactions that challenge the reflexes. Therefore, action-adventure games engage both reflexes and problem-solving, and both violent and non-violent situations. So, definitions. An action-adventure game can be defined as a game with a mix of elements from an action game and an adventure game. Especially crucial elements like puzzles. Action adventures require many of the same physical skills as action games, but also offer a storyline, numerous characters, an inventory system, dialogue, and other features of adventure games. They are faster paced than pure adventure games because they include physical and conceptual challenges. Action-adventure games normally include a combination of complex story elements which are displayed for players using audio and video. The story is heavily reliant upon the player character's movements, which triggers story events and thus affects the flow of the game. Some examples of action-adventure games include The Legend of Zelda, God of War, and the Tomb Raider series. So, relationship to other genres. Exactly when a game stops being an adventure game and becomes an action game is a matter of interpretation. There are quite a few disagreements in the community and in the media over what actually constitutes an action-adventure game. One definition of the term action-adventure may be an action-adventure game is a game that has enough action in it to not be called an adventure game, but not enough action to be called an action game. In some cases, an action game with puzzles will be classified as an action-adventure game, but if those puzzles are quite simple, they might be classified as an action game. Others see action games as a pure genre, while an action-adventure is an action game that includes situational problem-solving. Adventure gamers may also be purists, rejecting any game that makes use of physical challenges or time pressure. Regardless, the action-adventure label is prominent in articles over the internet and media. The term action-adventure is usually substituted for a particular subgenre due to its wide scope. So, first of all, My opinion on the purist argument, or like, I won't play it if it's got puzzles or time constraints. Why would you be such a purist? It's a video game. It's a new video game. One that you probably could enjoy, you know? I just, I don't know. It feels like the only way I would understand like rejecting a game is rejecting a game into the genre, being like, no, that is not an action game. That is an adventure game with a tiny bit of action in it. Or no, that's not an adventure game, action adventure game. That's an action game with a little bit of problem solving, you know? It's just, it's hard when you've got where there's not clear set boundaries for defining what a game is, because I mean, at the end of the game, you're playing a video game, and if you're enjoying yourself, you're enjoying yourself. You're gonna enjoy yourself regardless of if it was an action game, and an action adventure game, and an adventure game, a sports game, a miscellaneous game. You're going to enjoy it, and that's really what matters. So. Okay, so subgenres within the action-adventure genre. So, although action-adventure games are diverse and difficult to classify, there are some distinct subgenres. Popular subgenres include the first-person action-adventure, which just makes use of first-person shooter gameplay, foregoing constant action in favor of important adventure game elements such as environmental problem solving and a complex plot. Notable examples of this would be Metroid Prime, Half-Life 2, Dishonored, Far Cry 3. Immersive Sims, typically games played from the first-person perspective that includes elements of role-playing, stealth, and platform games that create numerous gameplay systems that the player can use to complete objectives in many different manners, creating a sense of player agency and emergent gameplay. Then we've got the third-person action-adventure, in which gameplay is in the third person. Notable examples include games like the Tomb Raider series, the Legend of Zelda series, the Grand Theft Auto series, the Hitman series, and the Uncharted series. There's platform adventure games, which emphasize both exploration and puzzle solving, but also feature traditional platform game conventions. Examples of games of this type include the Tomb Raider series and the Metroid and Castlevania series. The term Metroidvania is derived from these latter two and used to describe games in this genre that are generally based upon isometric platform adventure, which features freely explorable environments with three-dimensional gameplay and two-dimensional graphics using an isometric projection. Stealth games. I believe we've already discussed stealth games under the action series. We did. Yeah. Right? Survival, stealth. Yeah, we did. Cool. But a stealth game can be seen as an action-adventure because it emphasizes avoiding detection by enemies rather than engaging them in direct combat, leading to a greater emphasis on exploration and puzzle solving than other types of action games. Notable examples include Metal Gear series, the Assassin's Creed series, the Splinter Cell series, and the Hitman series. Survival horror, which emphasizes inventory management and making sure the player has enough ammunition and recovery items to survive the horror setting. Survival horror is a thematic genre with diverse gameplay. However, so not all survival horror games share these features. The Resident Evil, State of Decay, The Last of Us, Left 4 Dead, and Silent Hill franchises popularized this subgenre and stand to date as the most popular franchise of its kind. And finally, the survival games, which have open-ended survival without the supernatural elements that can be found in survival horror games. So, gameplay. Action-adventure games are faster paced than pure adventure games and include physical as well as conceptual challenges, where the story is enacted rather than narrated. While motion-based, often reflexive actions are required, the gameplay still follows a number of adventure game genre tropes: gathering items, exploration of, and interaction with one's environment, often including an overworld, connecting areas of importance, and puzzle solving. While the controls are arcade style, character movement, few action commands, there is an ultimate goal beyond a high score. In most action-adventure games, the player controls a single avatar as the protagonist. This type of game is often quite similar to role-playing video games. They are distinct from graphic adventures, which sometimes have free-moving central characters, but also a wider variety of commands and fewer or no action game elements, and are distinct, too, from text adventures, characterized by many different commands introduced by the user via a complex text parser, and no free-moving character. While they share general gameplay dynamics, action adventures vary widely in the design of their viewpoints, including bird's eye, side-scrolling, first-person, third-person, over-the-shoulder, or even a three-quarters isometric view. Many action-adventure games simulate a conversation through a conversation tree. When the player encounters an NPC, they are allowed to select a choice of what they want to say. The NPC gives a scripted response to the player, and the game offers the player several new ways to respond. Due to the action-adventure subgenre's broad inclusive nature, causes some players to have difficulty finishing a particular game. To compensate for this lack of players' ability, companies have devised ways to give player help, such as helpful clues or allowing them to skip puzzles outright. Now, why would you let the player skip a puzzle? That's no fun. Be like Dark Souls. Give them a text that says, "Get good." History. So, Brett Weiss cites Superman 1979 as an action-adventure game, with Retro Gamer crediting it as the first to utilize multiple screens as playing area. Mark J.P. Wolf credits Adventure of the Atari VCS of 1980 as the earliest known action-adventure game. The game involves exploring a 2D environment, finding and using items which each have prescribed abilities, and fighting dragons in real time, like an action game. Castle Wolfenstein 1981 was another early action-adventure game, merging exploration, combat, and stealth. Allgame claimed the following titles released prior to 1982 were action-adventure games: Rescue at Regal 1980, Quest for the Rings 1981, and Venture 1981. According to Wizardry developer Roe A. Adams, early action-adventure games were basically arcade games done in a fantasy setting, citing Castlevania 1986, Trojan 1986, and Wizards and Warriors 1987 as an example. Although noting some similarities to Adventure, IGN UK argues that The Legend of Zelda 1986 helped to establish a new subgenre of action-adventure, becoming a success due to how it combined elements from different games to create a compelling hybrid, including exploration, adventure-style inventory puzzles, an action component, a monetary system, and simplified RPG-style level building without the experience points. Legend of Zelda was the most prolific action-adventure game series through to the 2000s. Games like Brain Breaker 1985, Xanadu 1985, Metroid 1986, and Vampire Killer 1986 combined a side-scrolling platform format with adventure exploration, creating the Metroidvania platform adventure subgenre. Similarly, games like 005, Castle Wolfenstein, and Metal Gear 1987 combined action-adventure exploration with stealth mechanics, laying the foundations for the stealth game subgenre, which would be later popularized in 1998 by Metal Gear Solid, Tenchu Stealth Assassins, and Thief: The Dark Project. The cinematic platformer Prince of Persia 1989 featured action-adventure elements inspiring games such as Another World 1991 and Flashback 1992. Alone in the Dark 1992 featured the use of 3D graphics, which would later be popularized by Resident Evil 1996 and Tomb Raider 1996. Resident Evil, in particular, created the survival horror subgenre, inspiring titles such as Silent Hill 1999 and Fatal Frame 2001. Action-adventure games have gone on to become more popular than pure adventure games and pure platform action games that inspired them. So that is the action-adventure game just overview. And now we're going to go over the three biggest topics that we haven't already gone over. They did mention, obviously, stealth several times as a potential, subgenre. So we've already done stealth. We've already looked at platform adventure games. We've already looked at isometric platform games. We've looked at first person and third person. So we have to go over immersive sims, survival horror, and survival games. So, the immersive sim. Oh, let me catch my breath already. Okay. An immersive sim, or simulation, is a video game genre that emphasizes the player's choice. Its core defining trait is the use of simulated systems that responds to a variety of player actions, which, combined with a comparatively broad array of player abilities, allow the game to support varied and creative solutions to problems, as well as emergent gameplay beyond what has been explicitly designed by the developer. This definition is not to be confused with game systems, which allow player choice in a confined sense of systems, which allow players to easily escape consequences of their choices. Immersive sims, by definition, allow for multiple approaches, and typically incorporate elements of multiple genres, including role-playing games, stealth, first-person shooters, platform games, and survival horror. Although they typically have smaller worlds than open-world games, they also generally allow for open-ended gameplay, allowing the player to progress in any order and pursue side missions alongside any main story missions. Immersive sims are generally compared to games developed by Looking Glass Studios. The first such game generally considered an immersive sim is Ultima Underworld, the Stygian Abyss, and other examples include Thief and Thief 2, System Shock and System Shock 2, as well as the first Deus Ex. I mean, the System Shock and Deus Ex makes sense because Deus Ex is kind of System Shock. The term immersive sim may also be used to describe the game design philosophy behind the immersive sim genre, which uses interacting, reactive, and consistent game systems to create emergent gameplay and a sense of player agency. So the concept. Immersive sims typically task the player to make their way through levels and complete missions, but do not enforce the means by which the player does this. A common example would be where the player character must get past a guard. The choice of how to do this would be up to the player. They may attempt to sneak around, use parkour or other similar abilities, aided with some equipment to slip around them, find small passages that allow them to get around the guard, create a distraction that draws the guard away from the post, convince or bribe the guard to ignore them, or simply attack and kill or disable the guard directly. The choices may be limited by the player character's ability and current inventory, and there may be consequences of the player's choices. For example, killing or disabling the guard could leave the guard's body to be found later, raising the alert level of other guards. However, the element of consequence can be seen as negative to players if taken throughout the game. For example, Dishonored introduced a chaos system that adjusted how enemy guards would behave due to how much violence and disturbance a player has done earlier in the game, which discourages players from trying different tactics to avoid making future encounters harder. This system was removed for Dishonored: Death of the Outsider, as well as the addition of optional quests to encourage alternate approaches to missions. Warren Spector, part of Looking Glass Studios, said that the immersive sims create the feeling that you are there. Nothing stands between you and belief that you're in an alternate world. Many of the key developers of Immersive Sims compare them to tabletop Dungeons and Dragons games hosted by a good game master, or to live action role playing games, and that there are set rules systems to keep it a game, but the game will react to the player's actions rather than force the player to conform to a specific action. Spector is credited with the term Immersive Sim in a post-mortem he wrote on the development of Deus Ex in 2000, although Spector himself attributes it to his Looking Glass colleague, Doug Church, instead. Mark Brown of the YouTube series Game Maker's Toolkit identified that a key differentiating feature of Immersive Sims is that they do not readily use scripted or fixed events. Instead, they use a consistent series of rules and systems throughout the game. These consistent systems then can be exploited by the player to complete objectives in unique and unpredictable ways, with the game reacting to the player's decisions. Brown uses the example of being able to fire rope arrows to climb on at any wooden surface in the original Thief, The Dark Project, while the 2014 Thief game limited what locations these could be used, removing the immersive sim element. Rick Lane of PC Gamer noted that while earlier games in the Elder Scrolls series were not immersive sims, the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion transitioned the series to an immersive sim. The concepts of immersive sims are designed to have the player imagine themselves as part of a consistent world, and games using immersive sim philosophies need not have gameplay systems normally attributed to immersive sims. A notable example is Gone Home, a narrative exploration game that has the player examine the state and objects in a home to piece together a story of events that happened there previously, but has otherwise very few game mechanics. Steve Gaynor of the Fulbright Company, which developed Gone Home, compared their approach to Looking Glass Studio games, stating that it's really about this feeling of being in a place and the designers trusting you to progress through it in a meaningful way. So the history. Warren Spector considered Ultima 6, The False Prophet, 1990, as the first game to have an immersive sim mentality as well as being played from a top-down view. It relied less on events and planned out puzzles, and instead provided the rule set and systems through its living world to allow players to craft their own solutions to situations. Spector described one playtesting example from Ultima 6 that he considered the genesis of an immersive sim genre, in which a playtester lacked a magical spell needed by his party to pass by a closed gate, and instead used a pet mouse character to sneak through small spaces and access the necessary controls to open the gate, something none of the developers had anticipated. Ultima Underworld, The Stygian Abyss, 1992, is considered the first game to demonstrate the necessary elements of an immersive sim according to Spector and others. It builds upon Ultima 6's gameplay and adding in the first-person perspective, predating Wolfenstein 3D, the game that first popularized first-person shooters by a few months. The first-person view helped to cement the impression that the player was part of the game's world that they had full control of, and completing the impression of immersion. Spector recalled that he had thought to himself, "Do you not realize that the entire world just changed?" on seeing the initial demo for Ultima Underworld. Other early examples include the System Shock 94 and its sequel System Shock 2 99, Thief, The Dark Project 98, and its sequel Thief 2 2000, Deus Ex 2000, and Arx Fatalis 2002. However, at the same time, more action-oriented games with strong narrative elements that followed from Wolfenstein 3D like Doom 93, Half-Life 98 drew larger commercial sales, making it difficult to gain publisher interest. Around 2006-2008, several games emerged that revitalized interest in the immersive sim, including the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, BioShock, Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, and Fallout 3. Spurred from these successful titles, there have been new titles in the Deus Ex series, including Human Revolution, as well as a planned System Shock 3 and Underworld Ascendant releases. New properties, including Dishonored and Prey, were developed acknowledging the design principles of immersive sims. So, performance in the video game industry. While the immersive sim genre is well received critically, the sales have been varying. The original Deus Ex sold more than 500,000 units. At the time, it was a respectable number, but its immediate sequel, Deus Ex Invisible War, was considered a commercial failure. More recently, while Deus Ex Human Revolution sold more than 2.1 million copies within a month of its release, its sequel, Mankind Divided, has not yet cleared 1 million in sales a year after its release. Dishonored 2 also did not see a sales uptake similar to the one the original Dishonored had. Jody McGregor of PC Gamer noted that there are other factors contributing to lower sales, including other competing games and changes in the sequel's marketing and approach. He also notes that immersive sims require more commitment from the player to invest and learn the game's complex interacting systems, in contrast to other games built around simpler mechanics, thus making immersive sims harder to sell. I don't really agree that those are harder to sell. In my opinion, something that makes me commit more to getting into the game means I'm getting more for my money. I'm getting more out of the game, more out of really everything. Jordan Thomas, a developer on Thief and the BioShock games, also said that immersive sims are very difficult to be built by groups other than large teams due to the complexity of such games, making contributions from indie games unlikely. Arcane's Harvey Smith believed that while the sales trends for immersive sims in 2010s were disappointing, there will always be a market for them, but there will need to be a balance between the cost of development to the lower sales numbers. Smith attributes the lower sales of more recent games to a general trend of players favoring fast-paced action games with strong multiplayer components, with publishers being wary of games without such elements. Immersive sims by nature tend to be single-player experiences requiring thought-out approaches, but Smith believes that new titles will adapt to these players' preferences in the future, particularly from indie developers. So it's really funny. You don't really think of immersive sims as something like, that's an immersive sim. That's just building up a world and all this stuff. It's not like a big thing or anything like that. No, it's actually, I never would have considered, Deus Ex, BioShock, all those as an immersive sim. But the more I think about it, the more I'm like, yeah, those kind of are. It's just not something I would have thought out on my own. Not that that's a problem. I very much enjoy it. All right. Moving on. The survival horror genre. Oh, my throat, though. Hold on. Survival horror is a subgenre of action-adventure and horror video games that focus on survival of the character as the game tries to frighten players with either horror graphics or scary ambiance. Although combat can be part of the gameplay, the player is made to feel less control than in typical action games through limited ammunition or weapons' health, speed, and vision, or through various obstructions of the player's interaction with the game mechanics. The player is also challenged to find items that unlock the path to new areas and solve puzzles to proceed in the game. Games make use of strong horror themes like dark maze-like environments and unexpected attacks from enemies. The term survival horror was first used from the original Japanese release of Resident Evil in 1996, which was influenced by earlier games with horror themes such as 1989's Sweet Home and 1992's Alone in the Dark. The name has been used since then for games with similar gameplay and has been retroactively applied to earlier titles. Starting with the release of Resident Evil 4 in 2005, the genre began to incorporate more features from action games and more traditional first-person and third-person shooter games. This has led game journalists to question whether long-standing survival horror franchises and more recent franchises have abandoned the genre and moved into a more distinct genre often referred to as action horror. Survival horror refers to, obviously, the subgenre of action-adventure video games that include horror game elements. The player character is vulnerable and underarmed, which puts emphasis on puzzle solving and evasion, rather than the player taking an offensive strategy. Games commonly challenge the player to manage their inventory and ration scarce resources such as ammunition. Another major theme throughout the genre is that of isolation. Typically, these games contain relatively few non-player characters, and as a result, frequently tell much of their story through second-hand, through the uses of journals, texts, or audio logs. While many action games feature lone protagonists versus swarms of enemies in a special environment, survival horror games are distinct from otherwise horror-themed action games. They tend to de-emphasize combat in favor of challenges such as hiding or running from enemies and solving puzzles. Still, it is not unusual for survival horror games to draw upon elements from first-person shooters, action-adventure games, or even role-playing games. According to IGN, survival horror is different from typical game genres in that it is not defined strictly by specific mechanics, but subject matter, tone, pacing, and design philosophy. So, game design. De-emphasized combat. Survival horror games are a subgenre of the horror game, where the player is unable to fully prepare or arm their avatar. The player usually encounters several factors to make combat unattractive as a primary option, such as a limited number of weapons or invulnerable enemies. If weapons are available, their ammunition is sparser than in other games, and powerful weapons such as rocket launchers are rare, if even available at all. Thus, players are more vulnerable than in action games. The hostility of environments sets up a narrative where the odds are weighed decisively against the avatar. This shifts gameplay away from direct combat, and the player must learn to evade enemies or turn the environment against them. Games try to enhance the experience of vulnerability by making the game single-player rather than multiplayer, and by giving the player an avatar who is more frail than the typical action game hero. The survival horror genre is also known for other non-combat challenges, such as solving puzzles at certain locations in the game world and collecting and managing an inventory of items. Areas of the game world will be off limits until the player gains certain items. Occasionally, levels are designed with alternative routes. Levels also challenge players with maze-like environments, which test the player's navigational skills. Levels are also often designed as dark and claustrophobic, often making use of dim or shadowy light conditions and camera angles and sightlines which restrict visibility to challenge the player and provide suspense. Although games in this genre also make use of enormous spatial environments. Well, it's a good thing we attempted to play the Resident Evil HD remake, so you really get a sense of what they're talking about. Enemy design. A survival horror storyline usually involves the investigation and confrontation of horrific forces, and thus many games transform common elements from horror fiction into gameplay challenges. Early release used camera angles seen in horror films, which allowed enemies to lurk in areas that are concealed from the player's view. Although many survival horror games make use of off-screen sounds or other warning cues to notify the player of impending danger, this feedback assists the player but also creates feelings of anxiety and uncertainty. Games typically feature a variety of monsters with unique behavior patterns. Enemies can appear unexpectedly or suddenly, and levels are often designed with scripted sequences where enemies drop from the ceilings or crash through windows. Survival horror games, like many action-adventure games, are sometimes structured around the boss encounter, where the player must confront a formidable opponent in order to advance in the next area. These boss encounters draw elements from the antagonists seen in classic horror stories, and defeating the boss will advance the story of the game. Excuse me. Yeah, sure. Let's look at the history of the survival horror. So the origins in the 1980s through 1996. The origins of the survival horror game can be traced back to earlier horror fiction. Archetypes have been linked to the books of H.P. Lovecraft, which include investigative narratives or journeys through the depths. Comparisons have been made between Lovecraft's Great Old Ones and the boss encounters seen in many survival horror games. Themes of survival have also been traced to the slasher film subgenre, where the protagonist endures a confrontation with the ultimate antagonist. Another major influence of the genre is Japanese horror, including classical No theater, the books of Edogawa Rampo, and Japanese cinema. The survival horror genre largely draws from both Western, mainly American, and Asian, mainly Japanese, traditions, with the Western approach to horror generally favoring action-oriented visceral horror, while the Japanese approach tends to favor psychological horror. Nostromo was a survival horror game developed by Akira Takiguchi, a Tokyo University student and Taito contractor for the PET 2001. It was ported to the PC 6001 by Masakuni Mitsuhashi, also known as Hiromi Oba, later joined GameArts, and published by ASCII in 1981, exclusively for Japan. Inspired by the 1979 Japanese-only stealth game Manbiki Shonen, or Shoplifting Boy, and the 1979 sci-fi horror film Alien, the gameplay of Nostromo involved a player attempting to escape a spaceship while avoiding the sight of an invisible alien, which only becomes invisible when appearing in front of the player. The gameplay also involved limited resources, where the player needs to collect certain items in order to escape the ship. And if certain required items are not available in the warehouse, the player is unable to escape and eventually has no choice but to be killed by getting caught by the alien. Another early example is the 1982 Atari 2600 game Haunted House. Gameplay is typical of future survival horror titles, as it emphasizes puzzle solving and evasive action rather than violence. The game uses creatures commonly featured in horror fiction, such as bats and ghosts, each of which has unique behaviors. Gameplay also incorporates item collection and inventory management, along with areas that are inaccessible until the appropriate item is found. Because it has several features that have been seen in the later survival horror games, some reviewers have retroactively classified this game as the first in the genre. Malcolm Evans's 3D Monster Maze, released for the Sinclair ZX81 in 1982, is a first-person game without a weapon. The player cannot fight the enemy, a Tyrannosaurus Rex, so he must escape by finding the exit before the monster finds him. The game states states its distance and awareness of the player, further raising the tension. Edge stated it was about fear, panic, terror, and facing an implacable, relentless foe who's going to get you in the end, and considers it the original survival horror game. Retro Gamer stated survival horror may have been a phrase first coined by Resident Evil, but it could have easily applied to Malcolm Evans's massive hit. 1982 saw the release of another early horror game, Bandai's Terror House, based on traditional Japanese horror, released as a Bandai LCD solar power handheld game. It was a solar-powered game with two LCD panels on top of each other to enable impressive scene changes and early pseudo 3D effects. The amount of ambient light the game received also had an effect on the gaming experience. That's interesting. I want to look at that real quick. Hold on. I want to read about this. Sorry. That's very interesting. What was it called? It was called... Yeah, sorry. I really want to read about this, so... Terror House. Here we go. Okay, so this thing is like a super, super old, like handheld. Do you remember those like old games where like you'd be looking at it and it's got like the you can like see all the elements on the screen, and like the player character is just like a black, like everything is just black pixels and everything, and like as you move the character, like image just shifts from here to here to here to here. That's what it basically is. So in 1982, Bandai decided to follow the example of colleagues from Epoch and muddied their own portable toy with Dracula and Frankenstein. The concept and gameplay here are very similar to Monster Panic. A boy gets into a haunted house, you need to dodge enemies, a similar feature with multi-phase. But from the point of view of technical implementation, the Bandais have prepared a couple of surprises. First, while the Monster Panic was powered by 2 lithium batteries, this game could be charged directly from sunlight. Secondly, the game has not 1 but 2 screens, one on top, one on bottom. Thus, the game provides for 2 scenes. First, we need to go through the field to the mansion, dodging ghosts and bats. And then on the second screen, you have to face Frankenstein, Mummy, Death, and Dracula. Doesn't really talk about, like, how the amount of light you got changes anything, but that's still a really interesting feature in my opinion. The fact that the amount of light you get actually changes the thing. Actually, there's another game that did that. It was Golden Sun, I believe. It was a handheld Game Boy game on the Game Boy Color. But, like, the cartridge itself had something that allowed it to detect the light. And the amount of light that it was getting actually changed the game. Anyway, back to survival horror history. 1982... No. The latter... No. Another early example of horror game released that year was Sega's arcade game Monster Bash, which introduced classic horror movie monsters, including the likes of Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and werewolves, helping to lay foundation for future survival horror games. Its 1986 remake, Ghost House, had gameplay specifically designed around the horror theme, featuring haunted house stages full of traps and secrets, and enemies that were fast, powerful, and intimidating, forcing players to learn the intricacies of the house and rely on their wits. Another game that has been cited as one of the first horror-themed games is Quicksilva's 1983 maze game, Ant Attack. The latter half of the 1980s saw the release of several horror-themed games, including Konami's Castlevania in 1986 and Sega's Kenseiden and Namco's Splatterhouse in 1988. Though despite the macabre, whatever. I do not know how to say this word. Macabre? Macabre? Closed captioning's getting it right. Whatever. Imagery of these games, their gameplay did not diverge much from other action games at the time. Splatterhouse in particular is notable for its large amount of bloodshed and terror, despite being an arcade beat-em-up with very little emphasis on survival. Macabre. Thank you. Shiryu Sensen, War of the Dead, a 1987 title developed by Fun Factory and published by Victor Music Industries for the MSX2, PC-88, and PC Engine platforms, is considered the first true survival horror game by Kevin Grifford of GamePro and 1UP, and John Szypanak. I don't know. Designed by Katsuya Iwamoto, the game was a horror action RPG revolving around a female SWAT member, Lila, rescuing survivors in an isolated, monster-infected town, bringing them to safety in a church. Macabre? It has open environments like Dragon Quest and real-time side-view battles like Zelda 2. The War of the Dead departed from other RPGs With its dark and creepy atmosphere expressed through the storytelling, graphics, and music, player character has limited ammunition, though the player character can punch or use a knife if out of ammunition. The game has a limited item inventory and crates to store items, and introduced a day-night cycle. The player can sleep to recover health, and a record is kept of how many days the player has survived. 1988, War of the Dead Part 2 for the MSX2 and PC-88 abandoned the RPG elements of its predecessor, such as random encounters, and instead adopted action-adventure elements from Metal Gear, while retaining the horror atmosphere of its predecessor. Yeah, I don't know how to do a soft R. Macabre. However, the game often considered the first true survival horror due to having the most influence on Resident Evil was the 1989 release Sweet Home for the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was created by Tokuro Fujiwara, who would later go on to create Resident Evil. Sweet Home's gameplay focused on solving a variety of puzzles using items stored in a limited inventory, while battling or escaping from horrifying creatures, which could lead to permanent death for any of the characters, thus creating tension and emphasis on survival. It was the first attempt at creating a scary and frightening storyline within a game, mainly told through scattered diary entries left behind 50 years before the events of the game. Developed by Capcom, the game would become the main inspiration behind their later release of Resident Evil. Its horrific imagery prevented its release in the Western world, though its influence was felt through Resident Evil, which was originally intended to be a remake of the game. Some consider Sweet Home to be the first true survival horror. In 1989, EA published Project Firestarter, developed by Dynamax. Unlike most other early games in the genre, it featured a sci-fi setting inspired by the film Alien, but had gameplay that closely resembled later survival horror in many ways. Travis Foss considered it the first to achieve the kind of fully formed vision of survival horror as we know it today, citing its balance of action and adventure, limited ammunition, weak weaponry, vulnerable main character, feeling of isolation, storytelling through journals, graphic violence, and use of dynamically triggered music, all of which are characteristic elements of later games in the survival horror genre. Despite that, it is not likely a direct influence on later games in the genre, and similarities are largely an example of parallel thinking. In 1992, Infogrames released Alone in the Dark, which has been considered a forefather of the genre. The game featured a lone protagonist against hordes of monsters. It made use of traditional adventure game challenges such as puzzle solving and finding hidden keys to new areas. Graphically, Alone in the Dark uses static, pre-rendered camera angles that were cinematic in nature. Although players had the ability to fight monsters as in action games, players also had the option to evade or block them. Many monsters could not be killed and thus could only be dealt with using problem-solving abilities. Game also used the mechanism of notes and books as expository devices. Many of these elements were used in later survival horror games, and thus the game is credited with making the survival horror genre possible. In 1994, River Hill Soft released Dr. Hauser for the 3DO. Both the player character and the environment are rendered in polygonals. The player can switch between three different perspectives: first, third, and overhead. And a departure from most survival horror games, Dr. Hauser lacks any enemies. The main threat is instead the sentient house that the game takes place in, with the player having to survive the house's traps and solve puzzles. The sound of the player's echoing footsteps change depending on the surface. In 1995, Warp's horror adventure game D featured a first-person perspective, CGI full motion picture video gameplay that consisted entirely of puzzle solving and taboo content such as cannibalism. The same year, Human Entertainment's Clock Tower was a survival horror game that employed point-and-click graphic adventure gameplay and a deadly stalker known as Scissor Man that chases players throughout the game. The game introduced stealth game elements and was unique for its lack of combat, with the player only able to run away or outsmart Scissor Man in order to survive. Features up to 9 different possible endings. The term survival horror was first used by Capcom to market their 1996 release of Resident Evil. It began as a remake of Sweet Home, borrowing various elements from the games, such as the mansion setting, puzzles, opening door load screens, death animations, multiple endings depending on which character survives, dual character paths, individual character skills, limited item management, story told through diary entries and frescoes, emphasis on atmosphere and horrific imagery. Resident Evil also adopted several features seen in Alone in the Dark, notably its cinematic fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backdrops. The control scheme in Resident Evil also became a staple in the genre, and future titles imitated its challenge of rationing very limited resources and items. The game's commercial success is credited with helping the PlayStation become the dominant game console, and also led to the series of the Resident Evil films. Many games have tried to replicate the successful formula seen in Resident Evil, and every subsequent survival horror game has arguably taken a stance in relation to it. So, the golden age of survival horror, which is 1996 to 2004. The success of Resident Evil in 1996 was responsible for its template being used as the basis for a wave of successful survival horror games, many of which are referred to as Resident Evil clones. The golden age of survival horror started by Resident Evil, reached its peak around the turn of the millennium with Silent Hill, followed by a general decline a few years later. Among the Resident Evil clones at the time, there were several survival horror titles that stood out, such as Clock Tower in 96, Clock Tower 2, The Struggle Within 98 for the PlayStation. These Clock Tower games proved to be hits, capitalizing on the success of Resident Evil while staying true to the graphic adventure gameplay of the original Clock Tower, rather than following the Resident Evil formula. Another survival horror title that differentiated itself was Corpse Party, 96, an indie psychological horror adventure game created using the RPG Maker engine. Much like Clock Tower and later Haunting Ground 2005, player characters in Corpse Party lacked any means of defending themselves. The game also featured up to 20 possible endings. However, the game would not be released in Western markets until 2011. Another game similar to Clock Tower series of games and Haunting Ground, which was also inspired by Resident Evil's success, is the Korean game known as White Day, a labyrinth named School, 2001. This game was reportedly so scary that the developers had to release several patches adding multiple difficulty options, and the game was slated for localization in 2004, but was canceled. Building on its previous success in Korean interest, a remake has been developed in 2005. River Hill Soft's Overblood, released in 96, is considered the first survival horror game to make use of the full 3D virtual environment. The Note in 97 and Hell Night in 98 experimented with using a real-time 3D first-person perspective rather than pre-rendered backgrounds like Resident Evil. In 1998, Capcom released the successful sequel, Resident Evil 2, which series creator Shinji Mikami intended to tap into the classic notion of horror as the ordinary made strange. Thus, rather than setting the game in a creepy mansion no one would visit, he wanted to use familiar urban settings, transformed by the chaos of a viral outbreak. The game sold over 5 million copies in 1998, which at the time 500,000 was considered great, proving the popularity of survival horror. That year saw the release of Square's Parasite Eve, which combined elements from the Resident Evil with RPG gameplay of Final Fantasy. It was followed by a more action-based sequel, Parasite Eve 2, in 99. In 98, Galarians discarded the use of guns in favor of psychic powers that make it difficult to fight more than one enemy at a time. Also in 98, Blue Stinger was a fully 3D survival horror game for the Dreamcast, incorporating action elements from beat-em-up and shooter games. Konami's Silent Hill, released in 1999, drew heavily from Resident Evil while using full-time 3D environments in contrast to Resident Evil's pre-rendered graphics. Silent Hill in particular, was praised from moving away from B-movie horror elements to the psychological style seen in art house or Japanese horror films, due to the game's emphasis on disturbing atmosphere fear rather than visceral horror. The game also featured stealth elements, making use of the fog to dodge enemies or turning off the flashlight to avoid detection. The original Silent Hill is considered one of the scariest games of all time, and the strong narrative from Silent Hill 2 in 2001 has made the Silent Hill series one of the most influential in the genre. According to IGN, the golden age of survival horror came to a crescendo with the release of Silent Hill. Also in '99, Capcom released the original Dino Crisis, which was noted for incorporating certain elements from survival horror games. It was followed by a more action-based sequel, Dino Crisis 2, in 2000. Fatal Frame from 2001 was a unique entry in the genre, as the player explores a mansion and takes photographs of ghosts in order to defeat them. The Fatal Frame series has since gained a reputation as one of the most distinctive in the genre, with the first game in the series credited as one of the best-written survival horror ever made. Meanwhile, Capcom incorporated shooter elements into several survival horror titles, such as 2000 Resident Evil Survivor, which used both light gun shooter and first-person elements, and 2003's Resident Evil Dead Aim, which used light gun and third-person shooter mechanics. Western developers began to return to the survival horror formula. The Thing from 2002 has been called a survival horror game, although it is distinct from other titles in the genre due to its emphasis on action and the challenge of holding a team together. 2004 title Doom 3 is sometimes categorized as survival horror, although it is considered an Americanized take on the genre due to the player's ability to directly confront monsters with weaponry. Thus, it is usually considered a first-person shooter with survivor horror elements. Regardless, the genre's increased popularity led to Western developers to incorporate horror elements into action games rather than follow the Japanese survival style. Overall, the traditional survival horror genre continued to be dominated by Japanese designers and aesthetics. 2002's Clock Tower 3 eschewed the graphic adventure game formula as seen in the original Clock Tower and embraced full 3D survivor horror gameplay. In 2003, Resident Evil Outbreak introduced a new gameplay element into the genre, online multiplayer and cooperative gameplay. Sony employed Silent Hill director Keiichiro Toyama to develop Siren. The game was released in 2004 and added unprecedented challenge to the genre by making the player mostly defenseless, thus making it vital to learn the enemy's patrol routes and hide from them. However, reviewers eventually criticized the traditional Japanese survival horror formula for becoming stagnant. As the console market drifted toward Western-style action games, players became impatient with the limited resources and cumbersome controls seen in Japanese titles such as Resident Evil Code Veronica and Silent Hill 4 The Room. Transformation, 2005 to present. In 2005, Resident Evil 4 attempted to redefine the genre by emphasizing reflexes and precision aiming, broadening the gameplay with elements from the wider action genre. Its ambitions paid off, earning the title several Game of the Year awards for 2005, and the top rank of IGN's Reader's Picks Top 99 Games list. However, this has led some reviewers to suggest that the Resident Evil series has abandoned the survival horror genre by demolishing the genre conventions that it had established. Other major survival horror series followed suit by developing their combat systems to feature more action, such as Silent Hill Homecoming and the 2008 version of Alone in the Dark. These changes were part of an overall trend among console games to shift towards visual action gameplay. These changes in gameplay have led some purists to suggest that the genre has deteriorated into the conventions of other action games. Jim Sterling suggests that the genre lost its core gameplay when it improved the combat interface, thus shifting gameplay away from hiding and running towards direct combat. Lee Alexander argues that this represents a shift towards more Western horror aesthetics, which emphasize action and gore rather than the psychological experience of Japanese horror. The original genre has persisted in one form or another. The 2005 release of Fear was praised both for its atmospheric tension and fast action, successfully combining Japanese horror with cinematic action, while Dead Space from 2008 brought survival horror to a sci-fi setting. However, critics argue that these titles represent the continuing trend away from pure survival horror and towards general action. The release of Left 4 Dead in 2008 helped popularize cooperative multiplayer among survival horror games, although it is mostly a first-person shooter at its core. Meanwhile, the Fatal Frame series has remained true to its roots of the genre, even as Fatal Frame 4 transitioned from the use of fixed cameras to over-the-shoulder viewpoint. Also in 2009, Silent Hill made a transition to an over-the-shoulder viewpoint in Silent Hill Shattered Memories. This wee effort was, however, considered by most reviewers as a return to the form for the series due to several development decisions taken by Climax Studios. This included the decision to openly break the fourth wall by psychologically profiling the player and the decision to remove any weapons from the game, forcing the player to run away whenever they see the enemy. Examples of independent survival horror games are the Penumbra series and Amnesia: The Dark Descent by Frictional Games, Nightfall: Escape by Xeno, Cry of Fear by Team Psych Scholar, and Slender: The Eight Pages, all of which were praised for creating a horrific setting and atmosphere without the overuse of violence or gore. 2010, the cult game Deadly Premonition by Axis Games was notable for introducing open-world, non-linear gameplay and a comedy horror theme to the genre. Overall, game developers have continued to make and release survival horror games, and the genre continues to grow among independent video game developers. The Last of Us, released by 2013 by Naughty Dog, incorporated many survival horror elements into a third-person action game. Set 20 years after a pandemic plague, the player must use scarce ammo and distracting tactics to avoid or kill malformed humans infected by a brain parasite, as well as dangerous survivalists. Five Nights at Freddy's, released August 8th, 2014, is a survival game taking place in a pizzeria with possessed animatronics. Series has gone to changes with Five Nights at Freddy's sister location and Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted. Latest game is Five Nights at Freddy's AR Special Delivery. Shinji Mikami, the creator of Resident Evil franchise, released his new survival horror game, The Evil Within, in 2014. Mikami stated that his goal was to bring survival horror back to its roots, even though this is his last directorial work, as he was disappointed by recent survival horror games for having too much action. That same year, Alien Isolation, developed by Creative Assembly and based on the Alien sci-fi horror film series, was released. The game updated the concept of a single unkillable villain chasing the protagonist throughout most of the game, requiring the player to use stealth to proceed, and received high praise for its AI, art decision, and faithfulness to its source material. In 2015's Until Dawn, developed by Supermassive Games, was published by Sony for the PS4. The game is an interactive drama in which the player controls multiple characters and features the butterfly effect system in which the player's choices can change the story and may dictate who survives the night. All playable characters can survive or die depending on the choices made. Players explore the environment from a third-person perspective and find clues that help solve the mystery. And finally, in 2017, Resident Evil 7's Biohazard, focusing on a return to survival horror for the series after several previous action-oriented entries were released by Capcom. It utilizes a first-person perspective and encourages resource management and puzzle solving. A remake of Resident Evil 2 was followed in early 2019, updating the game to include over-the-shoulder third-person shooter gameplay, similar to Resident Evil 4, while retaining the survival horror aspects of the original. Ooh, that's a lot. Survival horror has a lot in it, more than you would expect, but that's it for us today. Next week, we'll go into the Metroidvania, as well as jump into the action game genre. So we've still got a lot more to go over in terms of video game genres, but I'm really enjoying this deep dive into them and just honestly learning more than I thought I would. So I hope you all are enjoying this, just like I am, and until the next time, everybody. Stay funky, people.